Hey, I'm Tron and this is Word, the Word of God, one chapter every day. We have reached Exodus 21 with 36 verses. Now that the 10 commandments of God's law have been presented to the Israelite community, it's time to dive deeper into the practical applications of what that looks like. First, what do you do in a case of slaves? There's a clear distinction between the Hebrews and foreigners in verse 2. If you buy a Hebrew slave, he may serve for no more than 6 years. Set him free in the 7th year, and he will owe you nothing for his freedom. Family dynamics are then addressed as well, and what a master-servant relationship should function like, putting restraints on the owner of the slave and expectations on the servant. A slave, for instance, married into the master's family, has an elevated status. It may even lose the slave status. There's also a clear distinction between men and women, and a ritual in place for a slave who wants to remain in bondage. Next, we get to see how human life is valued in verse 12. Anyone who assaults and kills another person must be put to death. Here, there is a distinction based on intentionality between the accidental killing of a human and the deliberate taking of a life. Murderers have to die. The same goes for kidnappers. Striking a parent equals the death penalty too, but it goes even further in verse 17. Anyone who dishonors father or mother must be put to death. This one, I'm sure, is something parents even back then wrestled with. To what degree would the death penalty be applied? Disobedience or outright shame? I think the warning is clear for a child, but the safety valve is the parent's love for the child. There might be a greater latitude there because of the familiar bond, but it would have to be taken seriously and applied in perhaps extreme circumstances. It mirrors very closely the relationship between God and man. He often has way more grace for me than what I deserve. The rules then go on to describe how injury of persons and damage to property is handled. Equal and fair treatment of the parties involved is a standard rule of thumb. There's also another safety valve in place in a servant relationship to prevent abuse and permanent injury in verse 27. And if a man knocks out the tooth of his male or female slave, he must let the slave go free to compensate for the tooth. This being an example, but obviously other injuries included. That way, even slaves get a certain elevated status, confirming their humanity. Restrictions aim to limit retribution as well, trying to make sure more harm is not caused by the compensation, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. These rules will move into other areas as well. Property rights will be front and center, as well as what societal expectations are of the individual. That is tomorrow in Exodus chapter 22. Until then, Word.